In the dusty mountains of Afghanistan, where death lurked behind every rock and the smell of gunpowder mixed with desert sand, soldiers learned to judge people quickly. Life or death often depended on split-second decisions about who could be trusted. So when the guys in Bravo Company first saw the new medic assigned to their forward operating base, they made the same mistake that would later save all their lives. They looked at her small frame, her quiet voice, and her tendency to keep to herself in the medical tent, and they assumed she was just another inexperienced medic who had never seen real combat. They called her Med Tent Girl behind her back, not knowing that the person they dismissed so easily had already survived 3 tours in some of the most dangerous places on Earth. They had no idea that beneath her calm exterior was someone who had crawled through enemy fire to save lives, who had performed emergency surgery in collapsed buildings while bombs exploded overhead, and who had already earned more commendations for valor than most of them would see in their entire careers. But war has a way of revealing the truth about people, and sometimes the person you least expect to be a hero turns out to be exactly the person you need when everything goes wrong. Sarah Martinez had learned long ago that being underestimated was often an advantage. At 26, she stood barely 5 feet 4 inches tall, with dark hair usually pulled back in a regulation bun, and brown eyes that seemed to take in everything while revealing nothing. When she arrived at Forward Operating Base Courage in the Kunar province of Afghanistan, the soldiers of Bravo Company saw exactly what she wanted them to see: a quiet medic who kept to herself and seemed more comfortable with medical supplies than with weapons. What they didn't see was the small scar above her left eyebrow from shrapnel in Fallujah, or the slight limp in her left leg from a roadside bomb in Baghdad. They didn't know that she had requested this assignment specifically because Bravo Company had lost 2 medics in the past 6 months, and their casualty rates were climbing. They certainly didn't know that she had graduated top of her class from the Army's Special Operations Combat Medic course, or that she had served with Rangers and Special Forces units in some of the most dangerous operations of the war. The base sat on a rocky plateau, surrounded by steep mountains, a strategic position that offered good visibility but made them an obvious target. The Taliban controlled much of the surrounding territory, and attacks on the base were becoming more frequent and more coordinated. The previous medics had struggled to keep up with the constant stream of wounded soldiers, and morale was starting to crack under the pressure. Sarah set up her medical station in the reinforced tent that served as the base's aid station. She organized her supplies with military precision, checked and rechecked her equipment, and studied the medical files of every soldier on a base. She learned their names, their medical histories, and their blood types. She memorized the layout of the base and identified the quickest routes between different positions and her medical station. She practiced emergency procedures until she could perform them in her sleep. The other soldiers watched her with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. Sergeant First Class Mike Rodriguez, a veteran with 3 tours under his belt, was particularly vocal about his doubts. "She looks like she'd pass out at the sight of blood," he told his squad during chow one evening. "Hope we don't have to count on her when things get real." Private First Class Jake Thompson, barely 19 and on his first deployment, was kinder but equally doubtful. "She seems nice enough," he said, "but I don't know if she's ready for this place. It's not like the hospitals back home." Even Captain David Hayes, the company commander, had his concerns. He had specifically requested an experienced combat medic, and Sarah's file, while impressive on paper, didn't show the kind of frontline combat experience he felt his unit needed. The previous medics had been overwhelmed by the intensity and frequency of attacks, and he worried that another inexperienced medic would crack under pressure. Sarah heard the whispers and saw the doubtful looks, but she said nothing. She had learned early in her career that actions spoke louder than words, and she preferred to let her work speak for itself. Instead of trying to convince anyone of her abilities, she focused on preparing for what she knew was coming. She studied intelligence reports about enemy activity in the area and noticed patterns that suggested a major attack was being planned. The Taliban had been probing the base's defenses for weeks, testing response times and looking for weaknesses. Radio chatter intercepted by intelligence suggested they were planning something big, possibly a coordinated assault designed to overrun the base entirely. Sarah began preparing for mass casualty situations, setting up additional medical supplies at key positions around the base, and creating emergency medical kits that could be quickly deployed to different areas. She identified soldiers with basic medical training and quietly began refreshing their skills, framing it as routine training rather than preparation for an emergency. The first real test came on a routine patrol. Corporal Danny Williams stepped on an improvised explosive device about 2 miles from the base. The explosion shattered his right leg and sent shrapnel into his abdomen. His squad called for immediate medical evacuation, but the helicopter couldn't land in the rocky terrain where the explosion had occurred. That's when Sarah surprised everyone. Instead of waiting for the wounded soldier to be brought to her, she grabbed her medical pack and headed out to the patrol's location. "Where are you going?" Captain Hayes called after her. "To do my job," Sarah replied simply, already moving toward the base's exit. The patrol's location was in a small valley, surrounded by ridgelines where enemy snipers were known to operate. Standard protocol was to bring wounded soldiers back to the base for treatment, but Sarah knew that Corporal Williams was losing too much blood to survive the trip. She needed to stabilize him immediately. Sergeant Rodriguez and 2 other soldiers provided security as Sarah made her way to the wounded soldier. The terrain was rough, and they had to move carefully to avoid triggering any additional explosive devices. Sarah moved with confidence, reading the landscape like someone had done this many times before. When she reached Corporal Williams, he was conscious but in severe pain and losing blood rapidly from his shattered leg. His squad medic, Private Thompson, was doing his best to apply pressure to the wounds, but he was clearly overwhelmed by the severity of the injuries. Sarah immediately took control of the situation. She worked with calm efficiency, first establishing a 4-line to replace lost fluids, then carefully examining the leg wound. The femur was fractured in multiple places, and the femoral artery had been nicked by shrapnel. Without immediate surgery, Williams would bleed to death within minutes. Working in the dirt beside the wounded soldier, with the constant threat of enemy fire from the surrounding ridges, Sarah performed a field procedure that few medics would have attempted outside of a fully equipped operating room. She carefully isolated the damaged artery and repaired it using techniques she had learned during her time with special operations units. The other soldiers watched in amazement as she worked. This wasn't the hesitant medic they had expected. This was someone who knew exactly what she was doing and had obviously done it before under similar circumstances. Her hands never shook, her voice remained calm, and she gave clear, confident instructions to the soldiers helping her. After stabilizing the artery, Sarah immobilized Williams' leg and prepared him for transport. The whole procedure took less than 20 minutes, but it made the difference between life and death. Williams would eventually make a full recovery and return to duty, but only because Sarah had been willing to venture into dangerous territory to save his life. As they carried Williams back to the base, Sergeant Rodriguez looked at Sarah with new respect. "Where did you learn to do that?" he asked. "Practice," Sarah replied, not elaborating further. Word of Sarah's actions spread quickly through the base. Soldiers who had dismissed her as inexperienced began to see her differently. They noticed things they had missed before. The way she moved with the confidence of someone who had been in combat many times, the scars that spoke of previous battles, and the quiet competence that came from years of experience in the most dangerous situations imaginable. But Sarah knew that saving one soldier, however dramatic, was just the beginning. The intelligence reports were becoming more ominous, and she could sense that something big was approaching. The enemy was planning something that would test not just her medical skills, but the survival of the entire unit. She continued her preparations, quietly positioning additional medical supplies around the base, and making sure that key personnel knew how to provide basic medical care if she was unable to reach them. She studied the base's defensive positions and identified the most likely casualty collection points if they came under heavy attack. As she worked late one night, organizing supplies and checking equipment, Captain Hayes found her in the medical tent. "You're not what I expected when I read your file," he said. Sarah looked up from a medical kit she was preparing. "What were you expecting, sir?" "Someone with less experience. Your file showed hospital rotations and training, but not much combat time." Sarah was quiet for a moment before responding. "Sometimes the most important parts of a person's story aren't in their official file, sir. But you'll know everything you need to know about me when it matters." Hayes nodded, beginning to understand that there was much more to his new medic than appeared on the surface. As he left the medical tent, he found himself hoping that whatever Sarah was preparing for wouldn't be necessary. But something in her manner suggested that she knew exactly what was coming, and that knowledge came from experience rather than training. The base felt different the next morning. The soldiers went about their duties as usual, but there was an undercurrent of tension that suggested everyone sensed that change was coming. Sarah went through her normal routine, but she also made sure that all her emergency preparations were in place. She had learned to trust her instincts, and every instinct was telling her that the real test was about to begin. The attack came at dawn on a Tuesday morning, just as Sarah had predicted. She woke to the sound of incoming mortars and the urgent voice of the watch officer over the base's communication system calling all personnel to defensive positions. This wasn't the usual harassment fire that the Taliban used to keep the soldiers on edge. This was something much bigger and more coordinated. Sarah was already moving before the first mortar round hit the ground. She had slept in her combat uniform for the past week, sensing that the attack was imminent. She grabbed her medical pack and her rifle and headed toward the command post to get a situational update. The base was designed with overlapping fields of fire and multiple defensive positions, but it was also small enough that a determined enemy could potentially overrun it if they were willing to accept heavy casualties. Captain Hayes was coordinating the defense from the main bunker when Sarah arrived. "What's the situation, sir?" she asked. "Multiple enemy positions in the surrounding hills," Hayes replied, studying a map marked with enemy contact points. "Intelligence estimates at least 200 fighters, possibly more. They've got us surrounded, and they're using coordinated fire to keep our heads down while they move closer." The sound of automatic weapons fire was getting closer, and Sarah could hear the distinctive crack of bullets passing overhead. The enemy was using a classic Taliban tactic: overwhelm the defenders with superior numbers while using the mountainous terrain to their advantage. What made this attack different was the level of coordination and the obvious planning that had gone into it. "Casualties?" Sarah asked. "Not yet, but it's only a matter of time. They're going to try to breach the perimeter. When they do, we're going to have a lot of wounded soldiers very quickly." Sarah nodded and began moving toward her planned casualty collection point near the center of the base. She had chosen this location because it offered the best protection from enemy fire while remaining accessible from all the defensive positions. As she set up her medical station, the first wounded soldier was brought in. Specialist Tommy Chun had been manning one of the forward observation posts when a mortar round exploded nearby. Shrapnel had torn through his left shoulder and upper arm, and he was bleeding heavily. Sarah immediately went to work, cutting away his uniform to expose the wound and applying pressure to control the bleeding. "How bad is it, Doc?" Chun asked, his voice tight with pain. "You're going to be fine," Sarah told him, her voice calm and reassuring even as bullets continued to crack overhead. "Just a flesh wound, but we need to clean it up and get some stitches in there." As she worked on Chun, 2 more soldiers were brought in. Private Martinez had taken a bullet in the thigh that had missed the major blood vessels but had fractured his femur. Sergeant Johnson had been hit by flying debris from an explosion and had multiple cuts on his face and hands. Sarah quickly triaged the wounded, determining who needed immediate attention and who could wait. This was where her special operations training became evident. She moved between patients with practiced efficiency, starting 4 lines, cleaning wounds, and administering pain medication. She gave clear instructions to the soldiers who were helping her, turning them into an effective medical team. Her hands never shook, and her voice remained steady even as the battle raged around them. The defensive positions around the base were holding, but barely. The Taliban fighters were using the rocky terrain to move closer to the perimeter, and it was becoming clear that they were planning to assault the base directly rather than simply harass it with long-range fire. Captain Hayes was rotating soldiers between positions to reinforce areas that came under heavy pressure, but he was running out of reserves. That's when the real crisis began. A group of Taliban fighters managed to breach the northern perimeter using a drainage ditch that provided cover from the base's defensive fire. They set up positions inside the compound and began firing on the defenders from behind. Suddenly, the soldiers of Bravo Company were taking fire from multiple directions, and their carefully planned defensive positions became death traps. The first soldiers to respond to the breach were cut down almost immediately. Private First Class Williams took a bullet in the chest that punctured his lung. Corporal Davies was hit in the abdomen by multiple rounds and was bleeding internally. Sergeant Rodriguez, who had been so skeptical of Sarah's abilities, was struck by shrapnel from a grenade that collapsed part of his defensive position. Sarah heard the calls for medical assistance over the radio and realized that the wounded were scattered across the base in positions that were under heavy enemy fire. Standard protocol would be to wait for other soldiers to bring the wounded to her medical station, but Sarah could tell from the radio traffic that the soldiers were pinned down and couldn't move without exposing themselves to deadly crossfire. That's when she made the decision that would define her legacy at Forward Operating Base Courage. Instead of waiting for the wounded to be brought to her, she grabbed her medical pack and rifle and headed directly into the combat zone to reach them. "Where are you going?" One of the soldiers helping at the medical station called after her. "To get our people," Sarah replied, already moving toward the sound of gunfire. What happened next seemed impossible to the soldiers who witnessed it. Sarah moved through the base under heavy enemy fire, using cover and concealment techniques that showed she had extensive combat training. She didn't just know how to treat wounded soldiers, she knew how to fight. She reached Private Williams first. He was pinned behind a concrete barrier with a sucking chest wound that was making it difficult for him to breathe. Enemy fighters were firing from positions less than 50 meters away, and any attempt to move would draw immediate gunfire. Sarah crawled to Williams' position and immediately began treating his wound, working in the narrow space behind the barrier while bullets passed just overhead. She inserted a chest tube to reinflate Williams' collapsed lung, a complex procedure that she performed while lying on her stomach in the dirt. As she worked, she used her rifle to return fire at enemy positions, keeping them suppressed while she treated the wounded soldier. Her marksmanship was precise and effective, suggesting that her combat skills were as well developed as her medical abilities. After stabilizing Williams, Sarah had to get him to safety. The medical station was across an open area that was covered by enemy fire. Moving during daylight would be suicidal, but Williams needed immediate surgery that couldn't be performed in the field. Sarah made another decision that shocked the soldiers watching from other positions. She called for covering fire from nearby defensive positions and then carried Williams across the open ground in a zigzag pattern that made it difficult for enemy fighters to target them. She moved with the confidence of someone who had done this before, using terrain features and smoke from explosions to mask her movement. Bullets kicked up dirt around her feet, but she never stopped moving until she reached the relative safety of the medical station. But she wasn't finished. Corporal Davies was still pinned down at another position with internal bleeding that would kill him within hours if he didn't receive treatment. Sergeant Rodriguez was trapped in his collapsed position with a head injury that was affecting his consciousness. Sarah looked at the other wounded soldiers at the medical station and made a decision that went against every rule in the medical manual. She turned the medical station over to Corporal Smith, who had basic medical training, and headed back into the combat zone. "Keep pressure on the bleeding," she told Smith. "Start 4 fluids on anyone who's conscious. I'll be back." The soldiers watching from defensive positions later said it was like watching someone who was immune to enemy fire. Sarah moved through the base with tactical precision, using the terrain and the smoke from explosions to mask her movement. She reached Corporal Davies and found him semi-conscious with multiple gunshot wounds to his abdomen. Working in a shallow depression that provided minimal cover, Sarah performed emergency surgery to control Davies' internal bleeding. She made incisions with surgical instruments while automatic weapons fired just meters away. Her hands remained steady as she identified damaged blood vessels and repaired them using techniques that few surgeons would attempt outside of a fully equipped operating room. While she worked on Davies, enemy fighters spotted her position and began concentrating their fire on her location. Sarah continued operating with one hand while returning fire with her sidearm using the other. She killed at least 3 enemy fighters while simultaneously saving Davies' life, demonstrating combat skills that suggested extensive special operations experience. After stabilizing Davies, Sarah faced the same problem she had encountered with Williams: how to get a seriously wounded soldier across open ground under enemy fire. This time, she had an idea that surprised everyone. She used smoke grenades to create concealment and then called for a coordinated assault on the enemy positions that were threatening her route back to the medical station. "All positions, this is Martinez," she called over the radio. "I need concentrated fire on the northern breach in 30 seconds. Keep their heads down for 60 seconds, and I'll get Davies back to safety." The coordinated fire was devastating. Sarah had identified the exact enemy positions that posed the greatest threat, and the defensive positions targeted them with precise, coordinated fire. Under cover of this assault, Sarah carried Davies to safety using a fireman's carry that allowed her to move quickly while keeping her rifle ready to return fire. But the most dangerous rescue was still ahead. Sergeant Rodriguez was trapped in a collapsed defensive position where the roof had been brought down by enemy fire. He was conscious but disoriented from a head injury, and enemy fighters were trying to reach his position to finish him off. The position was isolated from the rest of the base's defenses, and any rescue attempt would require crossing a large open area under direct enemy observation. Sarah studied the situation and realized that a conventional rescue wouldn't work. The enemy had positioned fighters specifically to prevent anyone from reaching Rodriguez, and they had the entire route covered with crossfire. She needed a different approach. That's when she demonstrated the full extent of her special operations training. Instead of trying to reach Rodriguez by the most direct route, she used a drainage tunnel that ran under part of the base to approach his position from an unexpected direction. The tunnel was narrow and partially flooded, but it allowed her to reach Rodriguez without being detected by enemy fighters. She found Rodriguez semi-conscious and bleeding from multiple wounds. The collapsed roof had trapped his legs, and he was unable to move. Enemy fighters were already trying to dig through the rubble to reach him, and Sarah could hear them working just meters away. She had to get Rodriguez out immediately, but she also had to do it quietly to avoid alerting the enemy fighters to her presence. Working in almost complete darkness, Sarah treated Rodriguez's head injury and prepared him for movement. She used small explosive charges from her combat kit to carefully collapse part of the tunnel wall, creating an opening large enough to pull Rodriguez through. The explosion was small enough to avoid detection, but it allowed her to extract the wounded soldier from his trapped position. Getting Rodriguez back through the tunnel required her to drag him through flooded passages while carrying both their weapons and her medical equipment. The journey took almost 30 minutes, during which enemy fighters continued to search for Rodriguez's position above ground. When Sarah finally emerged from the tunnel system with Rodriguez, the other soldiers couldn't believe what they were seeing. By now, word of Sarah's actions was spreading throughout the base, and the soldiers were beginning to understand that their quiet medic was someone exceptional. She had not only treated wounded soldiers under fire, but she had demonstrated combat skills that rivaled the most experienced infantry soldiers. Her tactical knowledge, marksmanship, and ability to operate independently in a hostile environment showed that she had training and experience far beyond what appeared in her official file. But the battle was far from over. The enemy assault was intensifying, and Sarah knew that the base was still in danger of being overrun. As she worked to stabilize Rodriguez, she was already planning her next move. The wounded were safe for the moment, but the fighting was about to enter its most dangerous phase. As Sarah finished stabilizing Sergeant Rodriguez, the tactical situation at Forward Operating Base Courage was becoming desperate. The Taliban assault had been more successful than anyone had anticipated. Enemy fighters had established positions inside the perimeter. The northern defensive line had collapsed, and ammunition was running low in several positions. Most critically, Captain Hayes had been wounded when an enemy sniper's bullet grazed his skull, leaving him temporarily incapacitated and unable to coordinate the defense. The command structure was breaking down just when it was needed most. Without central coordination, the defensive positions were fighting independently, unable to support each other effectively. The soldiers were brave and well-trained, but they needed someone to take charge and organize a coherent response to the enemy assault. The question was who had the experience and authority to fill that role. That's when Sarah Martinez made a decision that would save the entire unit, but would also reveal the truth about her background that she had kept hidden for so long. She activated her emergency command authority, something that existed in her classified file, but had never been mentioned in her regular personnel records. All stations, this is Bravo 6 Medical, she called over the command radio frequency. I'm assuming tactical command under emergency protocol 77 Alpha. All unit commanders acknowledge. The radio was silent for a moment as the soldiers processed what they had just heard. Emergency protocol 77 Alpha was a classified procedure that allowed certain special operations personnel to assume command during crisis situations when regular command structure had broken down. The fact that Sarah even knew about this protocol, let alone had the authority to invoke it, told the soldiers everything they needed to know about her real background. Bravo 6 Medical, this is Bravo 2-1. I acknowledge your command, came the first response from Staff Sergeant Thompson, who was commanding one of the remaining defensive positions. One by one, the other position commanders acknowledged Sarah's authority. They didn't know the details of her background, but they recognized the confidence and competence in her voice. More importantly, they had witnessed her performance under fire over the past several hours, and they trusted her judgment. Sarah's first priority was to establish an accurate picture of the tactical situation. She had been moving around the base, treating wounded soldiers, which gave her a better understanding of enemy positions than anyone else had. She knew where the enemy was strongest, where they were vulnerable, and, most importantly, where they were planning to focus their next assault. Bravo 2-1, what's your ammunition status? She asked. Running low on rifle ammunition, but we've got plenty of machine gun rounds and grenades, Thompson replied. Bravo 3-2, enemy activity in your sector? Quiet for the last 15 minutes, but I can see movement in the rocks about 200 meters north. Looks like they're setting up for another assault. As Sarah gathered information from each position, a clear picture emerged. The enemy had successfully breached the northern perimeter and established positions inside the base, but they had paid a heavy price in casualties. Their original plan had probably been to overwhelm the defenders quickly, but the fierce resistance had forced them to adopt a more cautious approach. The Taliban fighters were now preparing for a final coordinated assault designed to overrun the remaining defensive positions. Intelligence intercepts suggested they were planning to attack from 3 directions simultaneously, using their superior numbers to prevent the defenders from concentrating their fire effectively. Sarah realized that conventional defensive tactics wouldn't work in this situation. The base was too small and the enemy too numerous for static defense to be effective. She needed a plan that would use the defenders' superior training and equipment to offset the enemy's numerical advantage. All stations, we're going to execute a tactical withdrawal to the central compound, she announced over the radio. This is not a retreat. We're consolidating our position to maximize our defensive firepower. Each position will move on my command, covered by suppressive fire from adjacent positions. This was an extremely risky maneuver. Moving soldiers under enemy fire was always dangerous, but Sarah had identified a critical weakness in the enemy position. The Taliban fighters inside the perimeter were concentrated in the northern section of the base, which meant they couldn't effectively cover the entire area. By timing the movement correctly, she could get most of the defenders to safety while minimizing casualties. The first position to move was Bravo 2-1, led by Staff Sergeant Thompson. As his soldiers began their movement toward the central compound, Sarah coordinated suppressive fire from multiple positions to keep enemy heads down. She had positioned herself where she could observe both friendly movement and enemy positions, using her combat experience to time the covering fire perfectly. The movement was successful, but Sarah noticed something that concerned her. The enemy response was too weak and too uncoordinated. Either the Taliban fighters were more disorganized than she had thought, or they were allowing the withdrawal to happen for a reason. Her instincts told her it was the latter. "All stations, halt movement," she ordered. "Something's wrong. The enemy isn't trying hard enough to stop us." She studied the tactical situation more carefully and realized what was happening. The Taliban commanders were smart, and they had recognized that the defenders were consolidating their position. Instead of trying to prevent the withdrawal, they were allowing it to happen because it served their purposes. Once all the defenders were concentrated in the central compound, the enemy could surround them completely and use heavy weapons to destroy the position. Sarah had walked into a trap, but she realized it just in time to do something about it. The enemy was repositioning for a final assault that would come from all directions simultaneously. When it came, the concentrated defenders would be sitting ducks for mortar fire and rocket-propelled grenades. "Change of plans," Sarah announced. "We're not withdrawing to the central compound. We're going on the offensive." The soldiers couldn't believe what they were hearing. Going on the offensive when outnumbered and under siege seemed like suicide. But Sarah had seen something that the others had missed. The enemy's plan to surround the central compound required them to spread out their forces, which would make them vulnerable to a concentrated counterattack at the right point. Bravo 2-1 and Bravo 3-2, you're going to assault the enemy position in the northern section. Bravo 4-4 will provide covering fire from the eastern position. When the assault begins, all remaining positions will lay down suppressive fire on the southern and western approaches to prevent enemy reinforcement. Sarah's plan was based on classic special operations tactics. Hit the enemy where they least expected it, with maximum force at exactly the right moment. The Taliban fighters had positioned themselves to defend against a withdrawal, not to repel an assault. If the attack was executed properly, it would catch them completely off guard. But the plan had one major problem. Someone needed to coordinate the assault from close range, and that person would be exposed to enormous risk. Sarah knew there was only one choice for that role. "I'll be leading the assault," she announced, knowing that this revelation would shock the soldiers who still thought of her as a medic. Staff Sergeant Thompson was the first to object. "With respect, Doc, that's not your job. You need to stay back and treat casualties." "My job is to make sure this unit survives," Sarah replied. "Right now, that means leading this assault." As she prepared for the attack, Sarah finally revealed the truth about her background to the soldiers she was about to lead into combat. "Before I was assigned to this unit, I served 3 tours with the 75th Ranger Regiment and 2 tours with Special Forces. I've led more combat assaults than anyone currently on this base. I know what I'm doing." The soldiers stared at her in amazement. The quiet medic they had dismissed as inexperienced was actually one of the most combat-experienced soldiers they had ever served with. Everything made sense now. Her tactical knowledge, her marksmanship, her ability to perform under pressure, and her authority to assume command during emergency situations. The assault began at exactly 1,400 hours. Sarah led 12 soldiers in a coordinated attack on the enemy positions in the northern section of the base. They moved with the precision of a special operations unit, using covering fire and coordinated movement to advance through terrain that the enemy thought was impassable. Sarah's combat skills were immediately evident. She moved like someone who had done this hundreds of times before, reading the terrain instinctively and positioning her soldiers to maximize their effectiveness. Her marksmanship was exceptional, and she seemed to know exactly where enemy fighters were positioned before they revealed themselves. The assault caught the Taliban fighters completely by surprise. They had positioned themselves to defend against an attack from the south, not from the direction of the base's interior. Sarah's soldiers hit them from behind and from the flanks simultaneously, using superior training and equipment to devastating effect. The fighting was intense, but brief. Within 30 minutes, Sarah's assault team had cleared the enemy positions and secured the northern perimeter. The Taliban fighters who weren't killed or wounded retreated toward the mountains, abandoning their plan to overrun the base. But Sarah's tactical brilliance went beyond just the assault itself. She had timed the attack to coincide with the arrival of helicopter gunships that had been called for earlier in the battle. As the enemy fighters retreated across open ground, they were caught by devastating fire from the air. The coordinated ground and air assault turned what could have been an orderly withdrawal into a rout. By 1500 hours, the battle was over. The Taliban assault had been completely defeated, with enemy casualties estimated at over 60%. More importantly, Bravo Company had suffered no fatalities, though several soldiers had been wounded. Every wounded soldier had survived because of Sarah's medical skills and her willingness to risk her own life to save theirs. As the dust settled and the base began assessing damage, the soldiers of Bravo Company looked at Sarah Martinez with new understanding. The woman they had called Med Tent Girl, behind her back, was actually a decorated special operations veteran who had probably saved all their lives. Captain Hayes, who had recovered from his head wound, found Sarah in the medical tent treating the last of the wounded soldiers. "I think you, and I need to have a conversation about your real background," he said. Sarah looked up from the soldier she was treating. "My background is in my classified files, sir. I don't talk about it because it's not relevant to my current assignment." "Not relevant?" Hayes asked incredulously. "You just saved this entire unit." "I did my job," Sarah replied simply. "I'm a medic. My job is to keep soldiers alive. Sometimes it means treating wounds, and sometimes it means winning battles." Word of Sarah's actions spread quickly through the military community in Afghanistan. Within days, every unit in the region knew about the medic who had single-handedly organized the defense of Forward Operating Base Courage and led the counterattack that saved the entire garrison. But Sarah Martinez didn't seek recognition or awards. When offered a promotion and transfer to a prestigious assignment, she declined, choosing to stay with Bravo Company. "These soldiers trusted me when it mattered," she explained. "I'm not abandoning them now." The soldiers of Bravo Company never called her Med Tent Girl again. From that day forward, she was known simply as Doc, a title that carried enormous respect in the military community. But those who served with her during the Battle of Forward Operating Base Courage knew her by a different title. The soldier who proved that heroism comes in many forms, and sometimes the person you least expect to be a warrior turns out to be exactly the warrior you need. Years later, when veterans of Bravo Company would tell stories about the war, they would always remember Sarah Martinez not as the quiet medic who kept to herself, but as the soldier who risked everything to save their lives when it mattered most. Her legacy wasn't just in the soldiers she treated or the battle she won, but in the lessons she taught them about making assumptions about people based on appearances. Sarah Martinez had learned to be underestimated because it gave her an advantage. But when her fellow soldiers needed her most, she showed them that the most dangerous warriors are often the ones nobody sees coming. In a world where strength is often measured by size and volume, she proved that true courage is quiet, competent, and willing to do whatever it takes to protect the people who matter. The Battle of Forward Operating Base Courage became a case study in military academies. But for the soldiers who lived through it, it was simply the day they learned that their medic was actually their guardian angel. And sometimes that's exactly what courage looks like.